I understand it's been a very full day, and I'm overwhelmed by the level of knowledge and information sharing that we had here. I'm extremely grateful and delighted by the discussion. So it's very difficult to articulate specific questions because I've got so many in my mind. So I would like to start with a burning question for me as a professor of addiction science. We are seeing in recent years a rapid development of behavioral addiction, so not related to the use of a substance, especially connected with the problematic use of the internet, like gaming, gambling, pornography online, and so on. My question, by looking at the future of psychedelic science, is there a role for psychedelic in the treatment of the problematic use of the internet and internet-related addiction? And another related question is about end-of-life care. We learn a lot about the use of psychedelic in different therapeutical settings, but very little has been said about research and the future of end-of-life care and the use of psychedelics. So I leave it to the panelists who would like to address these questions. I think we have an additional microphone.
Maybe that one?
Or maybe on the table.
Yeah.
So the first question is about behavioral addiction and problematic use of the internet. Is there a future for psychedelic therapy in this emerging field?
So I know I'm not supposed to be on the panel, but I was kindly asked because Professor Amine left, so I'm doing instead of him. In terms of behavioral addiction, very little has been done yet, but there's one pilot with ketamine for gambling addiction that gave good results, and so that's being scaled up, and we are, as mentioned, also launching a gambling study with psilocybin, and I think definitely there's a very interesting possible role for psychedelic treatments in those conditions, and in a way probably all behavioral. The reason why we and others are starting in gambling is that that's the formally recognized behavioral addiction in the criteria, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't be interesting to test it for some of the others. It's just a bit more difficult to navigate the regulatory system and funding resources for the other ones. But Johns Hopkins have recently launched one for 5 different behavioral addictions, I think with psilocybin. So gambling being one of them and gaming being another one, and I forgot the 3 others, maybe shopaholicism, I don't know. Actually I don't remember what the others are. But yeah, time will show because it's really early days, but totally worth, and that's why we and others are going to try.
That's great to hear, because it will be a growing priority, especially in the next 5 to 10 years. So this is coming. Very few people at the moment are going to services with problem with behavioral addiction, but the number is growing rapidly. So to have some solution, like possibly the use of psychedelic in the field, I'm absolutely sure it will be very interesting to know and to prepare for this coming. How about the end-of-life care?
Well, I think there's 2 parts of the end-of-life care. One is for the hospice context, where people are within, weeks or a month or so near the very end of life. And then the other is once people have potentially a diagnosis of a life-threatening illness, which can be, cured potentially or so. So I think that psychedelics have a major role in both of those areas. And I'll just share that in the hospice settings, people are already using ketamine for pain. And so you could easily just use higher doses of ketamine for depression, for psychological therapy, without any kind of significant difference, because you can give ketamine with people on all these other drugs and you don't have to withdraw them from the drugs. So it's easy and it makes a lot of sense. And I'll just share that back when MDMA was still legal, there was a lot of work with people who were dying of cancer in the last few days of their lives. And what was reported, incredible, is that when you give MDMA to people who are on opiates, on all sorts of other medications, the opiates for pain makes you really sleepy as if you're not even really there. But you add that to MDMA and the stimulant properties of MDMA wake people up, and it synergizes, so you have the pain control is even better than the opiates by themselves. So some of these stories are just incredible of people who like come alive the last day or so of their lives to share with their loved ones and recapitulate their life. So I think the question is going to be who will pay for these studies, and those studies I think are the most complicated from a regulatory point of view, you're probably saying, because you're giving them to people on all these other medications, and but on the other hand, they're dying anyway, so what is the real risk? But I've heard of these just absolutely incredible stories of how psychedelics can be really helpful at the very end of life also.
Yeah, I'm just thinking now from a regulatory perspective. What diagnosis is this? ICD diagnosis, if you say end of life distress or whatever, and how do you call it? Could you do studies in such a situation, which would be very, very difficult. And so a stance regulators took when we had these kind of questions in scientific advice a couple of years ago was that, so if you can show that it works in depressive disorder or in anxiety disorder, so you have an indication and you can give it in these situations. So you don't need to do the studies in these patients. I mean, you get a license for treatment of depression, you get a license for treatment of anxious distress, for example, and then you have anxious distress is the diagnosis regardless of the situation where this occurs. So if it is an end of life, or if it is like in a certain after, if it has a generic, a genuine disease or disorder without having a reason or whatever, but to create a certain type of diagnosis which is not that defined in the diagnostic schedules and the DSM-5 or in the ICD-10 or 11. So we don't have this diagnosis, end of life distress. We just have anxious distress, or we have severe depression, but you can have that when you have these diseases, when you have an end of life disease. So you can give these products. So I don't see that this problematic if you can show that it works.
Would pain also work? You could just use it for pain, because there's been early work with LSD for pain control, and so that could be something perhaps you could prescribe it for as well. Well, you get medications for pain. Yeah.
Yeah, so this table is about the future. So my question is a bit futuristic and perhaps optimistic, but it would be nice to hear what you think about this. So we have talked about the experiential side of these substances, and given the title of this conference, we are focusing on psychopathological aspects or end of life, where it's easy to see the ethical motivations to investigate and to work on regulation stuff. But what about people who don't have psychopathologies? And we know that there are traditional uses of psychedelic substances within rituals that are very important in spiritual terms for the evolution of the spiritual side of individuals and communities. So do you think there is going to be some kind of evolution towards usage of psychedelics within special settings, of course, legalized, but for personal development?
Yeah, well, what we have a situation in America that's kind of unusual is we have such a strong religious right in America that there are now legal protections for religions to do all sorts of different things that you wouldn't normally think. So there are now hundreds of psychedelic religions in the United States that have set up churches that are not being shut down by the police. There's one called the Church of Ambrosia in the San Francisco Bay Area that has 70,000 members to whom they provide mushrooms. There's the DEA just gave the third approval. That the only ones that are technically legal by the DEA are the Native American Church, the use of peyote, and then the União de Vegetal, the use of ayahuasca. So they've just created a legal protection for a new one called the Church of the Eagle and the Condor, which combines peyote and ayahuasca. But there's even churches that have said MDMA is a sacrament. And so they're operating in the open with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of members across the United States. So there's this general letting it happen, and the concern is that if there was going to be a police challenge, that they might actually win in court, and then that would establish the precedent. So I think that this idea of going beyond just what's in the diagnosis. Also, the former director, and I'm really curious what you have to say about this, but Tom Loughran was the former director of the Division of Psychiatry at FDA. And what he said is that there's nothing in the law that prevents the FDA from approving MDMA for couples therapy, even though couples therapy is not in the DSM. They've never done anything. It would probably take a legal challenge, but he says there's nothing in the law that it must be in the DSM. But I think that the state programs that are happening in America, like the one that just unfortunately lost in Massachusetts, but in Oregon and in Colorado, there's sort of two tracks. The people that are trained as guides, those that are licensed to do therapy, can see people that present with depression or anxiety or PTSD, but they have a whole other group of guides that are not licensed therapists, and you can come and say, I want personal growth, or I want a spiritual experience. So we're already having that on a state level, not through the FDA. But is that the case at EMA, that it must be a DSM diagnosis to be approved? Is couples therapy, for example, remotely possible in Europe?
As far as I know, we need an indication for the EMA to have a license. So we do not license for for these traditional indigenous ritual uses. So that is something we are not responsible for. So that is something which has to be regulated by the law somehow, which is not regulatory activity, as far as I know.
I'm sorry, I want to say something and then you. No, I was thinking it is also not future, it's like Rick says, it's reality, it's happening now, and we see it also in the Netherlands. You have retreats where people can go to, can even do MDMA, which is then not really MDMA, but a derivative. But I'm a bit worried about the whole thing, because what you say, you really need licensed people that guide people, because everybody, they do not per se have a diagnosis, but everybody has trauma in themselves, which will be released. So we really need to take care of that regulation, that people are not trapped in something and are being misconducted. That were my thoughts. So I don't know, it's not up to EMA then, but it's up to, I think therapists, societies that really have to see carefully what they are offering, who it is, who offers it.
Yeah, or you could almost turn that completely around and say, so, for instance, I mean, there are these studies on large scale. They're not particularly brilliant quality because of the nature of the data, but looking at people who have used psychedelics at some time in their lifetime versus any other substance, that it looks like the psychedelic use might be preventive, could be biased and confounded by a lot of things. But if we for a second believe that they, in a way, history of use might actually make people more resilient toward recent distress or suicidality, and which has been published, then my question will go back to Marion and challenge it a bit and say, if that is the case, if you can reduce neuroticism, if you can increase well-being in healthy people, and we know all these are vulnerability factors for developing mood disorder, aren't we then in a way tapping into something that is in direction of preventive medicine, like vaccines? I'm not saying psychedelics would work as vaccines, but if you apply that thinking, why couldn't regulators potentially support and approve healthy studies if you are following long enough? It obviously needs to be big trials. If you could potentially build resilience and prevent some already defined in ICD and DSM, could that be an avenue? It's not that I mean, they're so big, those studies, that I wouldn't want to do them, but they're impossible to do. But I'm just to play with the thought, couldn't you theoretically design trials for psychedelics based on what we know they're doing also in healthies that could potentially be resilient building, preventive?
That's a very good question, and that leads to like personalized medicine, preventive medicines. Of course, there are strategies ongoing in all kinds of diseases. For example, Alzheimer's disease, prevention of. If you go early in patients who are asymptomatic, so the studies are going on and initiated. So this is something, of course, we could think of, but the studies have to be made. Yeah, I mean, this is something. I don't say that preventive studies would not be able to license something. If you can say, if patients are taking these medications, psychedelics, and had experienced traumas in their development life, and we could prevent then that they will develop serious diseases, psychiatric diseases. Of course, that would be something that we could encounter to develop. But how would such a study look like? That would be very difficult.
Well, there is one small, terrible study. Terrible because not the quality of the study, but because of what happened. So, the attack on the Nova rave in October 7th. There was 3,500 people at this rave. 359 or so were murdered. Most of the people were high on drugs, high on psychedelics. The attack happened at sunrise, where a lot of people timed their peak of their trips for sunrise. In the months afterwards, most everybody at the Nova Festival was receiving treatment for PTSD. And so there was a study done, about 550 people, that were those that were on MDMA when the attack happened were compared to those that were on LSD or psilocybin compared to those that were on nothing. And what they discovered is that those people that were on MDMA had fewer PTSD symptoms than those people that were on either psilocybin or LSD or on nothing. So it's suggestive evidence of some kind of preventative effect. It didn't mean that they didn't have PTSD, but that they had fewer symptoms. So the only theory that I would have is that they were somehow processing trauma when it was happening. They were able to kind of, I don't know why, but I do think this idea of certain kind of earlier psychedelic experiences as preventative. It's also the case that in the military, particularly in the US, where it's a volunteer, where most of the people that are in the military, a lot of them have had childhood traumas before they participate in the military, and then that makes them more vulnerable to developing PTSD from war-related trauma. So you could imagine part of boot camp to get people ready for the military would be give them an MDMA experience or something like that to deal with their existing traumas to help them be more resilient once it comes. So I don't know about how that gets kind of approved as a regulatory treatment for preventative medicine, but I think there is real good suggestions to think that some of these experiences with psychedelics could really be preventative for development of future mental indications.
When Nicola was asking the question, I was thinking, okay, that's not only a question for me, but just looking at the pattern of interaction, I think I want to add something, because the question was really about what do you do in non-clinical setting, and then we ended up talking about clinical setting. And that's what I see often happen, and I think because when we talk about psychedelic, I think it's a sort of synthesis of what happened in the global modern world, where you have always this discussion which somehow is polarized. You have like two extremes, and sometimes it's not easy to find a middle ground. And I believe that something that could overcome this sort of situation is to work more toward education and work more on sensibilizing the discussion, the public debate. But I think the strength of this should be focusing the public debate on scientific evidences. Because the only way we have to overcome this bipolar distribution where people are either in or out, it's probably sharing scientific knowledge and sharing facts. So maybe in the case, the social environment, the social and cultural environment will become more open to the debate, and maybe it will be some sort of more acceptable to start discussing about psychedelic also for the general consumption and the well-being.
Thank you for that. While we are on the educational, I'm just wondering, because most of our audience in the theater and online is made by students and early career researchers. How can we nourish their interest in psychedelic science? The request for this symposium comes from them. We gave one lecture on psychedelics, and I had an endless queue for weeks at the office. They all wanted to know more. The opportunities are not that many, especially here in Italy. They are future psychiatrists, psychologists. They need to have a training, but we don't have such a places where to train them. We don't have trials in Italy where they can take part. So how do you see the future? How can we do better to nourish this talent out there?
I think what you're doing now by having this conference, inviting people from other places and stimulating the environment academically here and clinically in Italy, I think that's the logical way to do it. And in a way, yes, Italy is have been a bit slow with the psychedelics. So has Denmark, that I'm born in, compared to some other European countries, and it is what it is, but it's obviously never too late, and in a way you have more evidence to build it on, so you can more strongly bring it in if you can convince the right people and the right systems, which in a way should be easier and easier, I would imagine. This year, not the best year in the history of psychedelics, but yes, I think you're doing the right thing, and I just hope it will expand and you'll get approvals to start doing some trials and answering some of the many remaining questions.
Thank you. So what I did years ago is I developed an elective for the students. So it was, I think, the right time. We had enough literature, so they can now follow, 6 weeks, 7 weeks of they dive into psychedelic medicine. So I think that is the way to go. Then they have it in their curriculum, they learn about it. By the time they are a medical doctor, I think it will not yet be approved, the therapy, but then they are able to talk to their patients about it and know the positives and the negatives about it. So that would be my approach.
Well, one thing that's easier to start is studies with animals. So, and you can learn a lot from it. So we've recently been approached and we're helping provide guidance to people that want to study MDMA with traumatized dogs. And there's been studies you may have heard about with the octopus, where you give MDMA to octopuses and now they become pro-social. So I think it's a lot easier to get approval for working with animal studies, and that could be a way relatively quickly for students in neuroscience to get really interested in this area. Well, you don't have to kill the dogs to do work with traumatized dogs, you know. And to say we already have had to do the dog and rat toxicity studies, so we already know toxicity studies in animals, so you could just do that. I'm not sure how well these animals are going to work on the integration process, but I think temporarily it may help them and it may reset some of these fearful behavior patterns they have. But I think that's a lot easier than human studies to get started.
Thank you.
So I have another question, still thinking about the future or part of the present, but so this renewed interest in psychedelics, as always, is attracting business. And so especially you, Rick Doblin, you have seen transitions throughout the last years from like donors to investment. And probably we will see this more and more in the countries where this is legal. But so what do you think can be the consequences to the field? Not just in having psychedelics in clinical settings, but in the general perception that people in the capitalistic world will have about psychedelics, do you see dangers, risks, opportunities, and your personal choices about this?
I think that what I've seen and what we talk about with the whole field is this idea that the investors are saying, oh, look what happened to Lykos, and let's try to minimize therapy and do it as inexpensively as possible. The example of Spravato is a tremendous success in the pharmaceutical world, but it doesn't really work as well as if you were to combine Spravato with therapy. And it doesn't work as well for depression, I think, if you do IV or IM generic ketamine for a few dollars. So and then you get this proliferation of patents. There's this incredible effort to try to then get patents even for what people have not originally invented themselves. So I see a lot is sacrificed from this idea of how to move through the regulatory systems with investors. And it's been heartbreaking to see that, because it's not about what's best for patients anymore in a lot of ways. But there is a tremendous opportunity in Europe here in the sense that Lykos is focusing on the FDA for the next 3-4 years or something like that. And so if there were a philanthropist that wanted to make MDMA into a medicine in Europe and turn it into a generic, and there are enormous concentrated pockets of wealth, and it just takes one of them. We haven't been able to find the right one, if any of you have any suggestions, but if you just had one philanthropist say, my guess is that for $80 to $100 million over 5 to 6 years, you could recreate all the data that EMA would want, even if it's 2 successful phase 3 studies, and then you could just turn it into a generic and do it completely open science. So it's who are those people that are willing to fund that? Because with Ibogaine, for example, Ibogaine is tremendous for opiate addiction. There are, helps people go through withdrawals, but it was early developed in the 80s, and the use patents have expired. So it's also possible now to make Ibogaine into a medicine without running into patent challenges in, again, open science and turn it into a generic. There are other people trying to work on Ibogaine-like drugs that don't have the heart problems, but I'm not quite sure how this would be seen, but from my view, the untreated opiate dependence is fatal in many cases. People have overdoses and die, and there are problems with the heart with Ibogaine, but that they're limited and mostly controlled, but could be very few fatal situations, and considering untreated, so I think the risk-benefit would be fine. So I'm sort of looking for this philanthropists that really want to do drug development in a different way to optimize outcomes, and then that becomes something that sets a standard. The other is the drug policy reform, which is way ahead in the US than in Europe, but if you create other opportunities for people to get access to these substances, even though they're not covered by insurance, it's a little bit of a check on the prices that pharma will charge for the investor-led developments.
One thing also that relates a bit to this, and also what you said earlier, Rick, about in a way, the fear that if the companies, for all these reasons, the recent FDA thing and what Comp has the strategy that some of these companies are logically applying by trying to reduce the talking therapy element, one of the fears that you expressed, which I totally follow, that if it then gets through like that, then the insurance companies, that I think actually probably is more of a US-based problem. So it goes a bit, because a lot of the systems in Europe are public health system with funding for the treatments, so it's less dependent, I think, on the insurance. I mean, I could be a bit wrong, and some countries might be more similar to the US. So in a way, that problem, it probably is worse in the US, I think. Another thing about that could address several things. What about work being done in Italy? If it's really difficult to get access to work with the classic psychedelics and MDMA, what about ketamine? I think a lot a lot more knowledge is needed about ketamine. There's so many open questions because Spravato was being developed as a very biological, non-talking therapy. So there's an open field. It's much easier ethically, design-wise, price-wise, to study a lot of the questions in ketamine than it is in the other drugs. So that could maybe be an absolute open avenue for people in Italy to study ketamine on a much larger scale. One really good study that is trying to address the also to the discussion between you two earlier, what is the role of the therapy? The perfect design, one good design at least, is to have 4 arms, isn't it? To have the drug and a placebo, and then to have talking therapy versus non-therapy. And then Rick is saying it might be unethical to do that with MDMA and PTSD, which I do not disagree on, but it is fine to do it with ketamine in depression. So, because there's already ketamine given without any talking therapy, so it's not unethical to keep on doing that in a trial. So it's much easier to study with ketamine. And what's her name? Celia Morgan's group in Exeter in the UK, they did that study, 4 arms, ketamine, placebo, talking therapy, which was tailored for alcohol use disorder, ketamine therapy, and then a psychoeducation comparison. So that was a 4-arm study. That study should be done, that design should be used for these drugs when you can ethically defend to do it, which you really can with ketamine, for instance, for depression. I'm sure some people are already studying it much more, but there's a lot of knowledge to gain there. That study, by the way, showed exactly what you would expect, that the most efficient was the combination of ketamine with proper therapy, and the least of the 4 was placebo with psychoeducation. So in a way, you had the expected distribution, which supports the importance of talking therapy with these drugs, in this case, ketamine for alcohol use disorder. But more work like that should be done, and that could probably be much more easily done if it's difficult to get through with the classics.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a few minutes for a question or two from the audience. There is a first hand there. I don't know who has the microphone. We take this one. Oh, no. And
Do they want to come up? So
maybe could you come here, please? Yeah, okay, let's.
but they won't hear online.
Online they cannot hear. Well, it's coming.
Hello, thanks for all the presentation. I have a question for Kim. And what are your thoughts on combining about the safety? What are your thoughts on safety about combining microdosing of LSD and psilocybin with neuromodulation, non-invasive neuromodulation therapy like TMS or TBS to improve the outcome in treatment-resistant depression and thanks to the neuroplasticity?
This one works too. Thank you for the question. So I think that a trial is taking place that wants to combine the two. We have thought about it too. I don't know what it would bring. Indeed, you have TMS inducing neuroplasticity and then the psychedelic inducing neuroplasticity, but perhaps a better addition would be to include some kind of therapy, because you open up this neuroplastic window with a psychedelic, and then it's good to work with the patient. You could think of training mindfulness therapy or something else. I think that would be a better combination, but that's my opinion.
I actually have a question regarding the type of clinical trials we are having right now and the considerations, because as we briefly touched upon, it's quite hard to disentangle treatment-specific and treatment non-specific effects in clinical trials with psychedelics. And my question is, would it be necessarily wrong to assume that treatment is effective even though it's not 100% due to treatment, meaning that if expectations, for example, are still an important part of this type of treatments, is it necessarily wrong to assume that it's not working because of the expectations. Like, for example, we know that expectancy effects, they play quite an important role in the results that we see now from clinical trials. So my question is, to what extent do we have to disregard them? Meaning, if part of the therapeutic outcome is also due to that, do we have to say that the treatment is not working because of this?
So in a way, what role do we need to, or what emphasis do we need to put on the role of expectancy?
I mean, also in general, to which extent do we have to differentiate treatment non-specific effects and treatment-specific effects if in the end they both contribute to remission of the patients?
I mean, okay, the microdosing is the ultimate example, I think, right? Because there we have amazing effects in any study with microdosing. But in the second that you implement placebo control, then that works equally well if people think it's a microdose, right? Actually, it seems to have 10 times higher predictive value for the outcome than actually taking a microdose, than thinking you take a microdose. So it's very driven by that, by the expectations. And if you have amazing results, so people improve in no matter what you measure to quite a significant degree, then who cares? And I would say the ones who cares are probably people like Marion, who needs to give it a license. It kind of needs to work beyond placebo. People with the money to invest in it, the pharma companies, they do care as well, because it's just not enough if it's all driven by only expectation and you can annihilate the effects. Kim disagrees and thinks microdosing really works. Maybe, it just hasn't been shown yet really, so maybe it will. And that would be exciting.
Yeah, but I don't throw microdosing under the bus, because
No.
small doses have been shown to induce effects, reduce pain sensitivity, effects on EEG level, on functional MRI, BDNF increases. So there are effects. So do not put it in a container and dump it. But I agree with you. Fight. That expectancy effects play a role. Yeah. That is a fact. But the question is then, is it bad that there is expectancy?
Actually, in our depression trial and in our anorexia nervosa trial, where we assessed the level of expectancy, there's no relationship between the level of expectancy and the treatment outcome in any of the two trials. Whereas in the trial where we had SSRI as a control, there is a relationship between the expectancy for improvement of the SSRI and the outcomes. So the expectancy seemed to play more of a role for the SSRI arm in that trial than for the psilocybin, and we don't see it either in the anorexia trial. So it's important to assess it, I think, and probably regulators would also like that to be part of the package that you are looking into, because it's just more thorough to try to fully understand what we are doing. But I think it is important that it works beyond just expectancy and placebo, and microdosing, maybe.
Thank you. I think we are coming to an end. Let's thank our panel and all of you for the participations. Hopefully see you again here next year. Let's see if we can carry on with this meeting as an annual event. Now there are some housekeeping notes for tomorrow and the projection of a video. So I will call Letizia on stage if she wants to present her work. But before, some notes and recommendations for tomorrow. We have our workshops, so we want to find out more about the contents and where to go. Thanks again to everyone.